So 1973, young lad, 14 years old, living in the West End of Newcastle in a working class community, um, beginning to buy records with the proceeds of my two paper rounds, uh, limiting mostly to kind of cheap budget mid price records. It was a big decision to push the boat out into a full priced one. But nevertheless, I was slowly but surely building the collection, and we're starting to share records between friends. So there was a friend at school who was maybe a year or two ahead of me in terms of building his music collection, or library as I call it these days. And he was great at lending me records. So that he introduced me to a number of acts, at least a couple of which are going to be in this top 20 today. Um, my memories of the period, in terms of what was going on, is very limited. All I can remember was power cuts. We had a 3-day week back in the UK. Used to go to school for short periods of time before the school had to close. And I think it was maybe the winter of 72, 73 where the power cuts were, almost, I think, daily, in fact, in the UK. And I was too young to take an interest in politics in those days. I was all about drawing, playing football, playing cricket, running, bird watching, but not politics. But one of the things that did happen, a momentous decision was taken by the UK government to join the European Economic Community, which became the European Union in time. And right up until 2016, when that all changed once more. Anyway, the records. I'm going to run down from 20 to number 1, from the 20th most important and best to the best one, at least for me. You'll recognise a few. There'll be some that have been long forgotten. The first one is the New York Dolls. Now, this was an album that was lent to me by that school friend, David Morrow, and he was lending me lots of really quite interesting stuff. It was Grand Funk by Grand Funk, Tangerine Dream album, a Genesis album, but this one didn't make sense to me at all. But I rediscovered it, probably through my growing interest in Bowie and Lou Reed, and the onset of punk music took me back to this album. It's an absolute classic now. Fantastic stuff. So what have we got the highlights in here? Well, you've got Trash, Jet Boy, which are both real big up-tempo numbers, similar pace. Personality Crisis opens the album. Looking for a Kiss follows. What's the other one that's really great? Well, no, I've already mentioned the one. It's Jet Boy I was thinking about there. Produced by Todd Rundgren, who we all know. I was never interested in the glam movement. Not interested so much in their kind of image. But just like the first Roxy Music album, this album gives credits to hair, makeup. So, straight just like Roxy. Anyway, there you go. That's number 20, the New York Dolls. Number 19. Put this in the bracket of long forgotten. It's Silver Bird by Leo Sayer. Now, Leo Sayer, first spotted him on Top of the Pops, dressed as a clown, like that, singing the single "The Show Must Go On." In fact, he's on the inner sleeve as well. There you go. That's his look of the period. And I thought it was interesting. I mean, that was a time when the charts were full of very different types of musical styles. But this album, I took more of an interest in it because he was championed at the time by Roger Daltrey of The Who. And he'd managed to corral a bunch of musicians from Argent, Bob Henrit and Russ Ballard, and I think it also had Mike Giles from, I think Mike Giles, ex of King Crimson, on drums on this album. Listening to this recently, once more, it's a real mixed bag. It's got a couple of kind of rocky tracks on it. Drop Back is one, kind of Russ Ballard style. But there's a couple of ballads on here which are really quite beautiful, still good. The Dancer, which closes side 1, and Why Is Everybody Going Home on closes the album on side 2. Now, why is everybody going home? I think that's maybe his rock fans, because this moment of credibility was soon surpassed by his kind of interest in pop hit singles, and he became middle of the road favourite of housewives of the day, and left his rock fans behind. But that's a good album. Right, number 17. No, is it number 17? No, it's number 18. Montrose. Ronnie Montrose, Sammy Hagar. So Ronnie Montrose, the guitarist, Sammy Hagar, the vocalist. And an album that, to me, still sounds timeless. It's produced by Ted Templeman, who produced Van Halen, and it has that clean, crisp, dynamic sound of those early Van Halen records. Absolutely superb. In fact, all the Van Halen records, to be fair. But this is great. It's got Bad Motor Scooter, which is kind of my entry point to this album, because I found that on a Warner Brothers compilation album. Space Station Number 5 is a classic as well, and Rock the Nation. Good album if you like hard rock. Don't play that so often these days, but it definitely stands the test of time. Right, now number 17, the Isley Brothers, 3+3. Now, I'd heard the singles, That Lady and Summer Breeze, on the radio. It's kind of familiar. But this album, it sounds like a greatest hits album, to be honest. It's got so many great tracks on it. Apart from the ones I mentioned, Don't Let Me Be Lonely Tonight, If You Were There, Listen to the Music, The Highways of My Life. Fabulous album. Now, at the time, back in the early mid-1970s, I really enjoyed the Temptations and Stevie Wonder. But thinking about the Temptations for a moment, to draw the contrast, they were very much a vocal group that had gone down the psychedelic path in the early 1970s. But they were still soul. And this is kind of a soul album, but it's more musical than that. It's like soul rock. The Isley Brothers were much more than their vocals. Great musicians as well. One thing that's worth checking out as well, if you're interested, you can pick this up pretty cheap. I think you can find it 3+3. But they also, or the record company, released this compilation on CD some years later, triple CD, which covers the best tracks on this particular album. But it's also got some of the more early stuff from the 60s, which include Jimi Hendrix playing kind of backup guitar, really. And Jimi Hendrix's sound and contributions to these early tracks are really quite special. Definitely worth seeking out. Right, let me just make sure I got my numbers right. Okay, number 16. And this is Uriah Heep Live. Now, when I listened to this album for the first time in possibly 20 years, just last week, the word came to me, thick. The whole album is thick. Thick on keyboard chords, guitar chords, and that dense bass and drum combo that give this a huge bottom end. If you don't know Uriah Heep, they were contemporaries of Deep Purple. Have very much a kind of Purple style sound here. The lead singer, David Byron, who is this guy here. Have you look at this cover, by the way. It's a really fabulous cover. This is what it was like back in the day for live albums. Ken Hensley on keyboards, Mick Box on guitar, and Lee Kerslake on drums, Gary Thayne, who died, on bass guitar, replaced by John Wetton. from King Crimson and later UK. That's kind of made in Japan type thing. Yeah, great cover. But anyway, sounded like Deep Purple. Yeah, David Byron, the singer, a bit like Second Division, Ian Gillan, similar diction and style of singing. But what's interesting about this particular band is that they were really quite derided at the time by the music critics because it was that plodding, big sound that they had. It's very, very short on guitar solos or even keyboard solos. It's just these big crashing chords. Now the best tracks on here, well, the introduction and Sunrise is fabulous. Easy Living was a single from their Demons and Wizards album, and that is really driving. It's fantastic. July Morning is a slow but long track, as is Gypsy, which is their big a big fan favorite. They close this album with a rock and roll medley, which is kind of unnecessary, but there's no doubt about it, they still bring a huge amount of energy to it. So yeah, Uriah Heep live. They continue to produce albums until fairly recently, if I recall. But my experience of dipping into their music from time to time is that they got progressively weedier as the years went by. Okay, number 15. We know this one, don't we? Paul McCartney and Wings, Band on the Run. Love this album. Contains some of Paul McCartney's with Wings, the Wings' best tracks. It's got the fantastic title track. It's got Jet. It's got Bluebird. Let Me Roll It. 1985 closes the album. It was recorded in Nigeria for some reason, but Beatles fans will know more about why that was the case. For me, there was I was kind of a bit skeptical about the Beatles, really. That's the inside cover, obviously taken in I think Lagos, and there's the lyrics. I was never a big fan of the Beatles in this particular period because the Beatles weren't played. The radio wasn't really played in my house at home. I think I might have mentioned in the past that my parents were particularly interested in big band music of the 40s and the early 50s. And they didn't really play the radio so much and certainly didn't buy any pop music. So the Beatles kind of passed me by. I only got interested some years, a couple of years after the Beatles split. But there was kind of a bit of a resistance. I had a resistance, but I wasn't the only one to the Beatles, because Radio 1 DJs on the BBC radio service, it's like they were still mourning the breakup of the Beatles, well, deep into the 1970s. And there was one DJ that came along later than 73, Mike Reid, who never missed an opportunity to play a Beatles song, kind of ignoring a lot of the other music of the day. And it was only later that I really thought, well, okay, I'll buy the 67 to 70 double, the Blue album, Beatles fans will know, and that sat and sits in my collection today. It, probably around about the 80s, I started to say, well, look, let's forget the prejudice and let's just go back to the Beatles. But even today, I still roll my eyes when people say the Beatles will never be surpassed. Fantastic though they were. It's come on, they're not the only players not in town. Anyway, that's Band on the Run. This one is number 14, and it's Billion Dollar Babies by Alice Cooper. Bought Schools Out as a single. Bought the Schools Out album a little bit later, but secondhand, so I didn't get the paper knickers. But this, I think, is my favourite Alice Cooper album. Wonderful tracks on here. Elected, No More Mr. Nice Guy, I Love the Dead, Hello Hooray. Fabulous album, really good, sounds amazing. Never saw them live. I think, to be honest, by the time I was going to gigs, which was 1975 and onwards, I think Alice Cooper as a band had peaked, and probably didn't come to the UK. That if they did come to the UK, they probably did London, Manchester, possibly Birmingham, but not Newcastle. But I could be wrong on that one. But never saw Alice Cooper live. Okay, number 13. I've got some notes here, which, if I get stuck, I'll I'll prompt myself. This one is another second-hand copy, an incomplete cover. I realised a long time ago, but it's Mott the Hoople and Mott. Now, you'll know Mott the Hoople, of course, because of All the Young Dudes. David Bowie gifted that single to Mott, and they started to build some success. And they were kind of associated with the glam movement as well, because they're all platform shoes and jumpsuits. But really, they'd already paid their dues on the touring circuit. They're a pretty hard band, proper band, but just got dressed up, I think. Ian Hunter here, good or even great songwriter. Interesting kind of half spoken, half singing vocal style. But some great songs. Better than All the Young Dudes, in my opinion. All the way from Memphis and Honolulu Boogie, both singles which I bought. But you've also got Hymn for the Dudes and The Ballad of Mott the Hoople, which is kind of a story of the road of a touring band. But you've got Violence on here as well, and just a great album. So that's Mott by Mott the Hoople, my number 13. Number 12, prog fans, Premiata Foneria Marconi, PFM, Italian prog, and the album Photos of Ghosts. Lovely cover, some lyrics there. Lyrics were written or translated by Pete Sinfield, who'd been involved with the King Crimson, of course, and had his own album as well. So he brings English lyrics to this Italian prog outfit that I think they were discovered by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I think this album's released on Manticore label, which I think is an ELP owned label. But because of that, they got exposure in the rest of Europe and in America, so they became quite big, and I saw them a couple of times. And their music, what's really interesting about it, is very symphonic prog. It's not pop music at all. It doesn't pretend to be pop music at all, although it's got a track called Celebration that's kind of upbeat. That became a famous encore for them. But what they've got violin and woodwind, as well as mellotron and guitar, and it sounds really quite beautiful in places. It's very dynamic, but there's no dissonance here. It's definitely of its time. But if you're into symphonic prog, PFM, this album and the album that followed, The World Became the World, are both absolutely excellent. But as I say, of its time. Photos of Ghosts by PFM. Another live album, number 11, Wishbone Ash and Live Dates. This Live Dates, you might remember if you're in the UK or maybe beyond, as I said, the shape of the package that you used to have dates that used to be able to, with a kind of a pin. You used to eat the dates. But this is a classic 1970s double live album. All the bands were doing it. Gave them an opportunity to stretch out and give quite different interpretations of their studio tracks. Here they're all better than the studio versions. It's more hard rock. I think I in my 1972 video I recommended Argus, which was their third album. And the style they had that was evident on Argus is that they had these dueling guitars, or these two guitars, but both very melodic and not really riffage, so to speak. But there was a kind of folky element in that as well. Here it's more of a hard rock vibe. The folk stuff is kind of pretty suppressed, which you probably would imagine is normal in a live setting. But this is a good album. And best tracks are the tracks from Argus. The King Will Come, Warrior, Throw Down the Sword. But you've also got Phoenix, which was on their first album, which is a long track, which is great. The only downside of Wishbone Ash is that the vocals are pretty weak. But there's two or three of them could sing, but not brilliantly. But they have got a good sound and a good album. It's probably the album to go for if you don't go for a best of. Wishbone Ash live dates, or Argus. Okay, top 10. We all know this one, don't we? Got me into classical music, I think. Virgin Records' first release. Not Mike Oldfield's best album, in my opinion, but definitely a milestone in rock music. What is remarkable about this album, in the round, is that this is a all instrumental album, apart from a little bit of narration at the end of side 1, at the finale of part 1, by Bonzo's Viv Stanshall, who introduces the main instruments one by one. But this is an instrumental album that made it to the mainstream. Now, these days, Mike Oldfield would be probably classified as new age. We didn't talk about those things back in 1973. And I'm sure there are albums out there today being released in the last 10-20 years under the new age banner that are as melodic and as interesting as Tubular Bells. But they've got no chance of making the mainstream, which is remarkable that Oldfield was able to do it, as a kind of a testament to how brilliant the music scene was in the early 1970s. So there we go, number 10. Another one that's long forgotten, no doubt, is Roy Wood and Boulders. Another multi-instrumentalist, just like Mike Oldfield, but Roy Wood, if you remember from 1972, he was a member of The Move, but by 1973 he left the band and became a solo artist. Same here, playing lots of different instruments on the inner sleeve. But he also created his own band, Wizard. And he was very photogenic. He was because he used to wear these makeup, and there's an album here which came out pretty much at the same time, Wizard Brew, and that's how he used to put the face paint on and the dress. So I used to draw pictures and paint pictures of Roy Wood in my school art class back in the day. But this is a real an album, another one of its time, a real eclectic mix. He definitely draws on rock and roll, and he's got this kind of yearny style, and his vocals. That is a bit tiresome, really, but this is an interesting, fun album. Lots of different styles. Dear Elaine was the big single in the UK. But yeah, Roy Wood, he's still doing I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day, Christmas shows every year, I understand. Never seen him do it though. Hey ho. Right, so that's Roy Wood and Boulders. And number 8, I'm not doing too bad with these notes, is John Martyn and Solid Air. Now, to my shame, I didn't get into John Martyn's music until the 1980s, when he was really playing quite experimental guitar stuff. Because I labelled him as a typical island label folky, and he was at the beginning. But he's responsible, I think, for what he called the Echoplex. It's like guitar effects kind of system. Didn't understand it then. Don't understand it now, but it means that he's although he retains a little bit of that that folky style, he also has these great guitar effects and these different sounds that are in amongst his music, which is really good. He's got this kind of thick voice, this kind of Scottish burr, and it's very, very smooth, and kind of slurs a little bit here and where but it makes he's very, I think it's recorded with a close, up close to the mic, and so when you listen to this, and the perfect time is like late at night or Sunday morning, it sounds like he's in the room with you. This is a tremendous album. It has his most famous song, which is May You Never, but it's all good, all good. Across the pond now for number 7. There Goes Rhymin' Simon by Paul Simon. Now, I knew Simon and Garfunkel, but I had no idea that Paul Simon had already released 2 solo albums before this one came along. I heard this because of caught my attention because of Take Me to the Mardi Gras, which was a single. But this is a very, very varied collection, and if you're a fan of Paul Simon, you'll probably put this very close to the top of your list. What's really remarkable here is it's just how intelligent his lyrics are and how varied, how musical he was. He's, you know, another singer-songwriter that did a lot more than just produce nice lyrics and a nice voice. Remarkable that he you know, he partnered with Art Garfunkel when he himself had such a great voice, really. But, you know, big long-time fans of those will probably know there's a story behind that as well. But it opens with Kodachrome, which is very upbeat. It's got Tenderness, which is kind of very yearny, very needy. So it sounds kind of a bit of a love song, but below the surface, it's kind of a bit of obsessiveness going on there. But Something So Right is great. Loves Me Like a Rock. It's got this, not surprising with a reference to Mardi Gras, it's got this New Orleans vibe. But it's got some interesting rhythms going on here, which kind of is signals where he was going to go when Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints came along many years later. So, the top 6. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road by Elton John. My first Elton John album, and still the best by a million miles. It's produced by Gus Dudgeon and engineered by David Henschel, who got involved with Genesis from the mid-70s onwards for a number of years, and it sounds massive. It's got loads of great hits on it, you know, the title track, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting, Benny and the Jets. And look at this cover, it's amazing. That's 1970s quality for you. But it opens with Funeral for a Friend, which is big, massive. Sounds just leaps out the speakers. Funeral for a Friend, that you know, instrumental that slowly gathers pace and then crashes into Love Lies Bleeding. It's a fantastic opening, and I think for years he opened his show with that combination of Funeral and Love Lies Bleeding. This is not background music because it just leaps from the speakers and it really grabs your attention. I think what's also good is that his voice is in great shape here. I think he had some vocal problems in the late 1970s, early 80s, had an operation, and ended up with his very affected singing style, his vocal style, and really quite off-putting. I don't like his voice these days, but I would buy this over any greatest hits collection. It's a fantastic album. So top 5, 1 or 2 familiar ones here. Bruce Springsteen, The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle. And second album, didn't discover this until I'd heard Darkness on the Edge of Town and then Born to Run, so that was 78 and beyond. Went back to his early albums, picked this one up, and it's kind of quite remarkable of how accomplished this one is. There's kind of two main vibes on this one, I would say, is that you've got the fast numbers like Rosalita and Kitty's Back and the E Street Shuffle itself, which opens the album, but you've got the more reflective kind of quiet epics on here as well. My favourite of which is the close of New York City Serenade. Incident on 57th Street, which has got a lovely guitar solo as well, great piano. But also you've got Sandy, 4th of July, Asbury Park. Great album from Bruce. Number 4 is the final live album of this period, and this is probably about my 3rd or 4th copy. This is Genesis Live, mid-price or low price, back in 1973. It was released at the same time as Lindisfarne Live. I think Charisma label was trying to run promotion, trying to get some of their acts. They did, I think, the 3 Bob tour, the 6 Bob tour. So Lindisfarne, Genesis and Van der Graaf Generator toured the UK just to try and raise everyone's profile, and Genesis benefited most from that. And this is a fantastic live album. It's only got 5 tracks. Watch of the Skies, Get 'Em Up by Friday, The Return of the Giant Hogweed, Musical Box and The Knife, and they're all versions. The versions here easily surpass anything on the studio albums. So this is where you find the definitive versions of the early Genesis classics, with the exception of Supper's Ready. Fantastic live album. Number 3, well, I'm a sucker for concept albums. I really like the idea of a musician who, or musicians who decide that they've got a big idea and they want to get that across, and they have that courage to see it through. And I particularly like albums, concept albums, that aren't dominated by like a hit single or two. It's one of the reasons why I like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis, and that there's a couple of singles tracks in there, Carpet Crawlers, Counting Out Time, that are good, kind of good on their own, but they definitely find their place in the bigger concept on the double album. And it's the same story with this one, and this is The Who and Quadrophenia. Here you've got 5:15. What was my glasses? 5:15, and kind of The Real Me. Yeah, I think it's only 5:15. That really was a single here. But all of these tracks, they continue to play some of these tracks live, and none of them sound as good today outside the confines of this album. So this is an album that demands to be listened to from beginning to end. This is my second copy. It's got a really nice booklet. Kind of the concept that somebody is a bit spaced out and London goes down to Brighton, a mod, of course. And his life, or at least a day in his life, down on Brighton Beach. But yeah, wonderful album. Opens wonderfully with The Real Me, closes with Love Reign Over Me. But that's kind of not a greatest hits. That is the best concept album that The Who ever did, in my opinion. So only 2 left, and it's 1973. What have I not mentioned so far? Well, this one, kind of obvious. Won't say too much about it, other than another concept album. Good lyrics that still stand the test of time. Musically, I think it's mixed. I mean, you've got Breathe, Time, Money, Us and Them, undoubted classics, but you've got other pieces like On the Run, which outstays its welcome, but doesn't quite outstay its welcome as long as The Great Gig in the Sky, which just seems to go on forever to me. And all those screaming Claire Torrey vocals on The Great Gig in the Sky. There's a new version, Roger Waters' Lockdown Sessions album that's just been released. He does a slow version of Comfortably Numb, which opens his recent shows, and that has similar vocals at the end of it, which I think are way superior to what we hear on here. And I'm not that keen on the second half of side 2 either. But yeah, multiple versions of this one over the years. Always gets a place. So what is my favourite album of 1973, and the most important one, and the best album? Well, it's another one that's got its flaws, but it is Selling England by the Pound by Genesis. My first exposure to Genesis, lent to me by that old school friend I mentioned earlier. This is where it really all came together for the band, where all that kind of clunkiness and kind of slightly ragged transitions during the some of the episodic epics in the earlier albums. I mean, Supper's Ready, for example, is wonderful, but some of the transitions between the various sections are like, oh, that was a bit harsh. Here it's really smoothed out and it works absolutely brilliantly. Opens with a cappella vocals from Peter Gabriel on Dancing with the Moonlit Night. It's got the kind of pop single I Know What I Like, which is in this context doesn't sound like a pop single at all. It's got Firth the Fifth, which has, in my view, the greatest guitar solo in rock music from Steve Hackett. And then you've got vocal showcase and drum showcase in The Battle of Epping Forest on side 2, and then you've got the keyboard extravaganza on The Cinema Show. But yeah, that's it. That's my top 20 albums of 1973. So now that I'll get this video out, I will start digging out albums from 1974, and I'll see you again in due course. Hope you made it this far. Thanks for watching. Ta-da.